G'day friends, this is Current Day Ross speaking to you to give you an update on this episode. So back in May of 2024, when this episode was being researched, Laurie and I came across some newspaper articles of a Henry Armstrong Lacey who was in Queensland at the start of the Boer War, and we naturally determined, based on all the information we had already researched, that Henry Lacey and the topic of today's episode is one and the same man. Now jump ahead to the end of August 2024, and the grandson of Henry Lacey actually contacted me and quite rightly pointed out that they are two different men, and also gave me a wealth of personal stories about his grandfather. So enjoy the updated version of this episode. Australia's military history is more than just a collection of dates and the locations of war-ravaged battlefields. It is the stories of service and sacrifice of those who have answered the call of their country of birth or adoption and the enduring legacy they have created. Join me as we look into one of those stories. I'm your host, Ross Manuel, and welcome to I Was Only Doing My Job, Australia's Military History, a Doc Network podcast. Now let's get started. G'day folks, and welcome to episode 71 of the podcast, recorded on the 26th of May 2024. This is the fourth episode that has been made in partnership with History Guild. Now, under normal circumstances, now would be the time that I would send you to check out our website or web store to pick up one of our awesome morale patches, but instead I recommend you check out historyguild.org and check out the hundreds of articles dedicated to educating people about Australia's contribution to battles in Greece, Crete and Malta. So join me now as I share the life, service and legacy of a soldier who served in not one or two, but three global conflicts, Henry Armstrong Lacey. Let's get started. Henry Armstrong Lacey was born on the 1st of April 1886 in Deer Park, a suburb of Melbourne, Victoria. He was the second of five children born to Francis Henry Lacey, a chemical engineer, and his wife Charlotte Matilda Harley. Lacey's father brought his wife to Australia to set up an explosives company to help facilitate the gold rush that was running through Victoria at the time. Not long after Lacey was born, though, Harry, as he was predominantly known, and the rest of the family moved to South Africa as the Witwatersrand gold rush had started near what is now Johannesburg. Not long after settling in South Africa, sadly his mother drowned. Francis would remarry, though according to the family, Lacey and his new stepmother did not get along, and he ran away from home at the age of 11 in 1897. 3 years later, Henry Armstrong Lacey would volunteer for service on the 1st of April to participate in the Second Anglo-Boer War as part of the Johannesburg Mounted Rifles, having lied about his age. While the Boer states had initially met the British regular forces in battle from 1899 to 1900, and early on enjoyed a degree of success, by the end of 1900, Britain controlled most of the Boer states, save for pockets of the northern Transvaal. So, like many territorial powers at the time, they realised that their strength lay in familiarity of the local terrain and support from the local populace. From 1900, the Boer states started implementing small unit insurgency-style guerrilla attacks against British-controlled assets, orchestrated by units known as Commando, spelled with a K. And is very similar to the colonial defence strategies of the British Empire, where the defence of the region was relegated to part-time soldiers that dated back to when these regions were controlled by the Netherlands. These commandos were essentially militia units who had the advantages of being small in number, highly mobile, and not dependent on the long supply lines needed by the British line infantry. To counter this, Lord Kitchener, the commander of the British forces in South Africa, began pursuing a policy of scorched earth, burning crops, salting fields, confiscating livestock, and forcing the entire Afrikaans population into concentration camps. In response, the Boer commandos started attacking rail lines and supply dumps more rapidly, in part to feed themselves, but also the Afrikaans population who was in hiding. Kitchener started using Dominion troops, particularly Australian State, and after the 1st of January 1901, Commonwealth forces, who had similar levels of skill in bushcraft to the Boers, and were all mounted to counter these attacks by providing security for the more lumbering and devastating British line infantry units. To supplement this, he also ordered the formation of irregular units of his own, mainly comprised of experienced but otherwise not engaged horsemen to fill the gaps in the line as more and more of his troops were being used to defend rail lines and occupy annexed Boer territory. These irregular units were raised specifically to counter the guerrillas, to fight them at their own game, to conduct the kind of counterinsurgency roles seen by modern-day special forces. However, what separates special forces from these irregulars is the lack of additional training or oversight. In total, Lacey would serve 3 years as part of the Johannesburg Mounted Rifles and then an additional 3 months as part of the Zululand Mounted Rifles. In these 2 units, he would participate in the Bapantha Rebellion, otherwise known as the Zulu Uprising. Following the cessation of hostilities in the Second Anglo-Boer War, British employers found it difficult to recruit Zulu farmers due to the allure from gold mines of Witwatersrand. In response to this, the colonial authorities introduced a poll tax on top of previous taxes to try and pressure Zulu men to enter the labour market. As you would expect, this did not go down well with the Zulu population, and in particular, Bapantha Kamakinza, the leader of the Zondi clan of the Zulu people, and apologies if I butchered that name. Despite being deposed by his own clan, he managed to raise a small force that launched a guerrilla war against the British forces. The campaign was short and brutal, with British troops with machine guns and cannons crushing the rebel force armed with spears, clubs, and cowhide shields. An estimated 3,000 to 4,000 Zulus were killed in the weeks of the uprising. The British and their levies would lose about 36. By 1910, Lacey had returned to Australia and settled in North Melbourne, working as a labourer on the wharves. He would marry Elsie Harrison in 1912, but sadly she would pass away of consumption in January of 1915. Not long after this, he would marry Annie Winifred Ward. Henry Armstrong Lacey would enlist in the First World War on the 5th of July 1915, and despite his previous mounted experience, volunteered for the Australian Imperial Force as part of the 4th Reinforcements to the 24th Battalion. After a period of training in Australia where he was promoted first to Lance Corporal on the 9th of August and then Corporal on the 11th of September, he departed for overseas service aboard the troop ship HMAT A-20 Horiata on the 27th of September 1915. The same month he departed, the Laceys would welcome their first child, a daughter Winifred Mabel, though it is unclear if Henry had an opportunity to meet her before he left. Lacey would arrive in Alexandria on the 27th of October 1915 and would be formally taken on strength with the 24th Australian Infantry Battalion on the 11th of November, while the unit was on Gallipoli. He would serve on Gallipoli until the evacuation a month later and return to Alexandria on the 10th of January 1916, where there the Australian and New Zealand forces underwent a period of expansion and retraining, where the existing number of divisions of the Australian Imperial Force and the New Zealand Expeditionary Force were doubled, with each battalion gaining a sister battalion comprising of both Gallipoli veterans and fresh volunteers, with the hope that the experienced hands would impart their knowledge onto the fresh recruits. In February 1916, the 24th was posted to Tel el-Kebir, where the unit enjoyed periods of leave to Westmala, Moascar, and even trips to see the Sphinx, where they would be camped for the remainder of the month until they received orders to proceed to France, and it was here that Lacey also reverted back to Lance Corporal. On the 20th of March, Lacey and the rest of his unit were back in Alexandria, boarding troop ships bound for Marseille, France. On arrival, they boarded trains for the nursery sector in northern France at Fleury in April to get used to the complexities of the war on the Western Front. May saw them relocated to the village of La Halle-Beau for further training. June saw the 24th inspected by the Australian Prime Minister, the Little Digger himself, the Right Honourable Billy Hughes, and lent work parties to assist the front lines near Armentières. Lacey and the rest of the 24th would get their introduction to war on the Western Front when they participated in Australia's bloodening in the Battle of Pozières as part of the second phase of Britain's largest Somme offensive. Australian troops had already participated in the capture of Fromelles the week before, which was the debut of the Australian Imperial Force on the Western Front. The village of Pozières was initially captured by the 1st Division on the 23rd of July 1916, and this division clung to its gains despite almost continuous artillery fire and repeated German counterattacks, but suffered heavily for it. By the time it was relieved on the 27th of July, it had suffered 5,285 casualties. Lacey and the rest of the 2nd Division would take over from the 1st and to go on to launch 2 more attacks around Pozières. The first, on the 29th of July, was a costly failure. The second, on the 2nd of August, resulted in the seizure of further German positions beyond the village, and again, Australians suffered heavily from the retaliatory bombardments. They were relieved on the 6th of August, having suffered 6,848 casualties. They would be followed by the 4th Australian Division, who equally endured German artillery bombardments. In total, the 3 divisions suffered 23,000 casualties. Because of the costly nature of the defence of Pozières and that more Australians were killed in the 2 days of fighting than in the entirety of the Gallipoli campaign, this prompted the Australian official war correspondent and historian Charles Bean to write that the site marked a, quote, a ridge more densely sown with Australian sacrifice than any other place on earth, unquote, and pushed the Australian government to purchase the land where the windmill previously stood, and this site would go on to become the site of the numerous memorials, and it's from there that soil was collected for the interring of the unknown Australian soldier at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. Following the 24th Battalion's involvement in Battle of Pozières, they would participate in the Battle of Mouquet Farm, and after this battle on the 27th of October 1916, Lacey would be promoted once more to sergeant. Lacey would be recommended for the Distinguished Conduct Medal on the 14th of May 1917 for actions during the Second Battle of Bullecourt, where the 24th suffered 80% casualties. The citation read, quote, "For conspicuous gallantry during the capture of the part of the Hindenburg Line on the 3rd of May 1917, in command of his platoon where his officer had fallen early in the action. He showed great powers of initiative in organizing his men in support of Lieutenant Pickett's party, and himself took prominent part in the bomb fighting. Though severely wounded in the foot, he remained on duty until ordered to the aid post," unquote. His wounds proved serious enough that he was evacuated back to England aboard the hospital ship Amberdonian, and admitted to hospital in Bristol. While there, his DCM recommendation would be downgraded to a military medal, which was presented to him on the 12th of June. He would write home to his parents, quote, "Number 3 Australian Auxiliary Hospital, Dartford, England, 12th of June, 1917. Just a few lines to let you know that I'm still in the land of the living. My foot is just about healed now, but they had it under the x-rays yesterday, and there is a small piece of shrapnel near the ankle yet, so I guess they'll be having a go at it with a knife in a day or two. I got a military medal awarded to me for something or other the other day. I was wounded. I think I told you before that I got my little lot when we hopped over and took the Hindenburg Line near Bullecourt. I can assure you that it was some stunt. Our company went in with 4 officers, 1 sergeant major and 5 sergeants. We had 1 officer and 1 sergeant major killed. The sergeant major died of wounds, and 3 officers and 3 sergeants were wounded, which left only 1 sergeant who came out of the whole skin. I don't know how the boys got on, but over half my platoon were killed and wounded when I left. It was one of the biggest stunts the Australians have been up to date," unquote. While he was recovering from his wounds, he would be admitted to the first Australian Dermatological Hospital at Bulford for 15 days while he underwent treatment for syphilis. Over the course of the First World War, it was estimated that approximately 63,350 cases of VD, or venereal disease, occurred amongst the 417,000 troops of the Australian Imperial Force, which equates to about 1 in 7 soldiers, or the equivalent of 3 infantry divisions, contracting VD at some point during the war. And considering that the average treatment time for VD in this point in history was 6 weeks of very painful urethral irrigations or intramuscular injections of mercury, meant that for 6 weeks of the war, the AIF lost 3 infantry divisions, which, considering the rate of volunteers and the fact that the AIF only comprised of 5 divisions, meant that the AIF considered the management of the VD a pressing concern. In most instances, contracting VD was considered a self-inflicted wound, and as such, soldiers were penalized for it, often with a reduction of part or all of their pay until they were treated, which, considering most were sending a portion of their pay back home to their families, would have definitely led to some uncomfortable letters. After he recovered from his quote-unquote wounds, in December 1917, he would rejoin his unit on the 22nd as they weathered another horrid winter in Europe, as they recovered from their involvements in many of the major battles undertaken by Australians in Europe in the back half of 1917. The 12th of January would see him once again in hospital, and it wouldn't be until the start of February that he would be back with the 24th. In 1918, despite being severely depleted, the 24th Battalion played a defensive role during the German Spring Offensive before supporting the attack at Hamel in July. In August, it joined the 100 Days Offensive, attacking around Amiens, where they joined the advance that followed. It was in this advance that Lacey would be wounded for a second time in the right arm, but remained in the line this time. It would be immediately followed up by another wound to the same arm in early October, as Australian and American forces captured Mount Brehane at the Battle of St. Quentin Canal, and would be sufficient enough that he'd be once again evacuated to the 1st Southern General Hospital in Birmingham, England for treatment and recovery. And it would be here that Sergeant Henry Armstrong Lacey, MM, would end his second war. He'd be invalided home on the transport ship, the HT Morvada, on the 4th of January 1919, and arrived in Australia on the 20th of February. He would be discharged from the Australian Imperial Force on the 16th of March, however it would take him until the 22nd for his wounds to fully heal. Sadly, his reunion with his family would have been bittersweet, as the Lacey's only child Winifred had passed away in 1917 at the age of 18 months. Post-war life for the Laceys was spent in the Victorian suburb of Carlton, where he built a house on Primrose Street, and in 1920 they would welcome a son, Henry Armstrong Lacey Jr., who would be followed in 1923 with another son, Frank Douglas. Returning to his job on the wharves, Lacey was also a member of the Union. Sadly, his involvement in the 1928 dock strike would see him banned from the waterfront. The 1930s would see Lacey Sr. employed as a presser and storeman in Brighton, which would also be his employer at the outbreak of the Second World War, and according to the family, the Great Depression affected Lacey heavily, as he would routinely walk from Brighton to Footscray every day in search for work, and would never eat in front of his young family. At some point during the Great Depression, he would also be employed as an orderly at the Caulfield Repatriation Hospital and found work with his former commanding officer, Stanley Savage, in the construction of the Cheltenham Golf Course. In 1931, the family would also be expanded once more with the birth of Robert Lacey. On the 23rd of October 1939, 53-year-old Henry Armstrong Lacey Snr. would present himself to the Brighton Recruitment Depot and proclaim before God, his king, the recruiter, and the 1903 Defence Act that he was in fact 35 years old and had no previous military experience. At this time, according to his family, Lacey also instructed his eldest sons not to follow him in volunteering for service, claiming quite correctly that, quote, it won't end by Christmas, unquote. Now, during the course of researching this episode, I was able to find several photos of Henry Lacey Snr., his paybook photo, and two taken during his time in the Second World War, where he is the focus, and several other photos from his time in camp, and there is no one on this green earth that would believe that he was 45, which was the maximum cutoff for the Second World War, let alone the 35 he claimed. Though, it must be stated, granted, I'm still not able to find photos of John Barney Hines from episode 2 from this same period, as you may recall, who served in the Boxer Rebellion, the Boer War, and the First World War, who as well as attempted to enlist in the Second World War in Sydney, only to be told this was a young man's war. The two photos of Henry Lacey show a man clearly in his 50s, who despite this is in amazing physical shape, which may have been the only reason why the recruiters agreed to let him join up. That being said, research has uncovered at least 76 men who had previous experience in at least the Boer War and the Boxer Rebellion and the First World War, who would actually go on to serve in the Second World War as well. After joining the second raising of the Australian Imperial Force, Private Lacey would report to Puckapunyal, Victoria for training as part of the 2nd 6th Australian Infantry Battalion, though he wouldn't be there for long, as on the 18th of November he'd be formally taken on strength with the staff of the 17th Australian Infantry Brigade as an orderly, which was fortunate as the 2nd 6th was suffering from a pharyngitis epidemic at the time. There is definitely a unique parallel between the story here of Barney Hines and Henry Lacey, as Hines' commanding officer in the First World War was Colonel Arthur Tubby Allen, who ended up in command of the 16th Brigade. He rejected Hines on account of his age. Conversely, one of Lacey's fellow soldiers in the First World War was Stanley Savage, who rose to be the commanding officer of the 17th Brigade, who decided to appoint Lacey as an orderly within his command. Now, while it isn't stated in his service record or in the unit diaries of the brigade or the 2nd 6th Battalion, anecdotally, according to the family, a possible reason for his reappointment came when Lacey, a proud Union man, called out an officer of the 2nd 6th who was allegedly a scab worker during the 1928 wharf strike, and when Lacey was presented to headquarters for punishment, Savage saw him and allegedly stated, quote, "What the bloody hell are you doing here," unquote, and promptly had him reassigned. Lacey underwent his third lot of training for war in the midst of bushfires threatening the camp, visits from notable military dignitaries, and a march through Melbourne. On the 30th of December 1939, Lacey was promoted to Lance Corporal for the third time in as many conflicts. During his time in the staff of the 17th Brigade, Lacey would also assist the brigade medical officer as a medical orderly, and according to his superiors had acquired quite an excellent first aid kit. Following his training and pre-embarkation leave, Lacey and the rest of the 17th Australian Infantry Brigade embarked aboard the transport ship HMAT Y2 Neuralia under the escort of HMAS Adelaide and the HMS Ramillies on the 18th of April 1940. The troop ships laden with soldiers from ports spanning Australia and New Zealand converged into Fremantle before setting sail for Egypt, under the naval escort of the British HMS Ramillies alongside the Australian cruisers HMAS Australia and Canberra. The journey mirrored the historic convoys of the First World War, which Lacey would have remembered. On the 1st of May, the convoy crossed the equator, which warranted the customary court of King Neptune, and considering this would have been Lacey's third trip across the equator, he would have already been inducted into the Shellback fraternity. After stopping in Colombo to take on supplies and fuel, the convoy continued to the Red Sea, finally putting into Alcantara on the Suez Canal. The 17th Brigade arrived in Alcantara on the morning of the 18th of May, and then from there they boarded trains to Bajira, where they made camp. Much like William Travers of the 16th Brigade and Ralph Horner in the 19th, Henry Lacey and the 17th Brigade formed part of the 6th Australian Division. And while Lacey will have had fond memories of camping in the Sphinx in Egypt, the legacy of Australian forces' exploits in Cairo casted long shadows over their presence in the region, which prompted the Egyptian government to insist on the relocation of Australian troops for training to outside Egyptian territory, despite the fact that they're mandated to defend the Suez Canal. From their camp at Gaza, they continued to train with the same outdated military equipment that Lacey would have used in the previous war. On the 20th of June 1940, Lance Corporal Henry Armstrong Lacey was awarded the British Empire Medal. The citation read, quote, Lance Corporal Lacey served on brigade headquarters as an orderly since its inception. He combined with his duties that of a medical orderly under the direction of regimental medical officers. He collected an excellent first aid kit, and through his efforts, the good health of the troops has been maintained. His devotion to this work and his unremitting attention to those in need has been outstandingly good. Lacey served in the Boer War and the Great War with distinction. His splendid character and wild experience were the means of directing troops from unsoldiery action to a better outlook on life. His influence over young soldiers maintained good discipline and steadied troops in battle during heavy bomb attacks, to such an extent that good qualities in this direction is attributable to his work and example, unquote. Not long after this, Lacey will be photographed by the official war photographer Damien Pera. It shows him in his tent preparing his gas mask. The caption alone suggests that any illusions that Lacey was anything other than a veteran twice over was long gone. Quote, Viet Jira, VX 4449. Private Henry Armstrong Lacey, MM of the 17th Brigade, is a bright and energetic veteran of the Boer War, Zulu Rebellion, Great War, and now this war, unquote. The 4th of August would see Lacey evacuated to the 1st Australian General Hospital on Gaza Ridge with a case of bursitis, which took him out of action for the rest of the month. He would rejoin the unit when they were in the process of moving to Helwan in Egypt, from where they started to receive the remainder of their equipment. On the 26th of September 1940, the Kingdom of Italy had entered the war on the side of the Axis powers and crossed the Egyptian-Libyan border with 215,000 troops on the 9th of September and made impressive gains in a relatively short time in concert with land invasions in Kenya, Sudan, and British Somaliland, before the Italian Viceroy, the Duke of Aosta, ordered his troops to halt and fortify their positions on the 16th of September, and in doing so, handed the initiative to Lieutenant General Archibald Wavell of Middle Eastern Command. This delay also allowed the still very inexperienced Australian Imperial Force a further chance to train. Not to be perturbed, the 17th Brigade continued to exercise and train at Helwan, attacking fortifications and preparing defences against armoured fighting vehicles. Throughout October and November, the 17th would join the 19th and 18th Brigades in divisional level training exercises, including a 3-day exercise at Berg Ir Arib on the 20th of November, in which the 16th and 17th Brigades attacked the 19th in defence. This autumn, I Was Only Doing My Job, an Australian military history podcast, has partnered with History Guild to bring you a series of episodes dedicated to telling the life, service and legacy of 4 Australians of the tens of thousands who served in the Mediterranean theatre during the Second World War, playing a vital role in that theatre. History Guild has created this project so more Australians can discover the stories of service and sacrifice of the Australians who fought there and honour them by visiting these battlefields. The History Guild website, historyguild.org, has guides to help people visit and understand the battlefields in Greece, Crete, and Malta. So, thanks, History Guild, for the support. Let's get back to the show. On the 29th of October, the 17th Brigade was relocated to Akinji Marut outside Alexandria and entered camp, digging in as the Italian forces launched air raids on the base. On the 9th of December, the considerably smaller Western Desert Force under the command of General Wavell launched Operation Compass, which was a 5-day raid on Italian positions led by Major General Richard O'Connor at the head of a force of 36,000 men, 275 tanks, 120 guns, and 142 aircraft against the Italian fortifications in occupied Egypt. The British 7th Armoured Division and the 7th Indian Division were instrumental in this initial phase and attacked the Italian positions at Sidi Barrani, delivering a stunning defeat. Their position was captured and 38,000 Italian soldiers were taken prisoner, the first of 130,000 Italians who ended up being captured during the raid. As the remnants of the Italian forces retreated across the border into Libya, the British 7th Armoured Division established itself to the west of Bardia, cutting off land communications between the strong Italian garrison there and Tobruk 96 kilometers away. On the 11th of December, the 4th Indian Division was withdrawn from the Western Desert Force and sent to the Sudan to participate in the East African Campaign. And in response, the 16,000-strong 6th Australian Division under Major General Ivan Mackay was brought forward from Egypt, despite being under-equipped, largely inexperienced, and according to most senior officers in both Australian and British commands, incredibly undertrained. Despite these obstacles, the 6th Division was immediately put in the line on the British right flank, and at the end of December, the 17th Brigade headquarters had moved to Sidi Hanesh in the Western Desert in preparation for its baptism of fire at the tiny village of the Egyptian-Libyan border named Bardia, in what would become the Australian Army's first action in the Second World War. Located in the Libyan region of Cyrenaica, Bardia is roughly 30 kilometers from the Egyptian border, which following Italy's colonization of the region became a fortified outpost with a 29-kilometer long string of defensive outposts, barbed wire, concrete bunkers, and trenches around the town and a small harbour. To quote Major Henry Marshall from the 6th Division, quote, "The Italians have spent a number of years developing Bardia and they considered it impregnable. They had made the terrain inside and the outside of the wire bald as a billiard ball and had constructed concrete posts along the wire in 2 rows. It was impossible to use any cover as there wasn't any," unquote. The Australian official historian Gavin Long described it in the official history as, quote, "At great expense of labour, steel and concrete, they had dug a defensive line in a form of arc 18 miles in length around a little harbour and the garrison town. They consisted of an almost continuous anti-tank ditch and behind it a double line of underground posts, the front line being linked by rows of barbed wire. The posts and the forward line were generally about 800 yards apart and were protected by their own anti-tank trench. They were armed with 1 or 2 47mm guns and from 2 to 4 machine guns. The guns were fired from concrete-sided pits but connected by trenches with deep underground shelter, which occupied most of the area of the post. 400 yards behind the forward line lay a second arc of posts, similar but lacking the anti-tank trench and sometimes without wire. Within this perimeter, aerial photography revealed the considerable array of artillery, estimated 110 guns, and some long stone breastworks. Each flank of the line lay on the inner bank of one of the steep-sided wadis carved into the cliffs forming the coast from Saloum northwards, but elsewhere the posts were in flat, almost featureless ground, offering little cover to an attacker and few landmarks, unquote. While the men of the 6th Division may have been inexperienced, the men in charge of the brigades and the division were all experienced officers from the Great War, and knew the ins and outs of attacking an entrenched, fortified opponent, with all seen extensive service in Gallipoli and the Western Front in battalion and brigade level commands. The plan orchestrated by General Mackay, commander of the 6th Division, called for Brigadier General Tubby Allen's 16th Brigade to attack the western side of Bardia's defences, supported by 23 Matilda tanks of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment, with Brigadier General Savage's 17th Australian Infantry Brigade in position ready to exploit the breakout. While the 3rd Brigade of the division, the 19th, was under Major General Horace Robertson in Divisional Reserve. These men were also supported by the sea by the Inshore Squadron, commanded by Royal Australian Naval Officer Captain Hector MacDonald Laws-Waller, the focus of Episode 32, and in the air by elements of No. 3 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force, commanded by Squadron Leader Peter St. George Bruce Turnbull, the focus of Episode 12. British and Australian intelligence estimated that the Italian fortress contained about 25,000 soldiers. The Australian attack was to be evaluated against the superb record of the 1st Australian Imperial Force, and the initial results were stunning. It would be seen by all accounts, however, that Lance Corporal Lacey took no part in the battle. In January 1941, the Australians went into action for the first time around Bardia, while the 16th Brigade led the assault. The 17th Brigade was assigned a supporting role. I've already covered the experience of the 16th and 19th Brigades in this battle in my episodes about Ralph Honor and Williams Holmes Travers, but the 17th Brigade's 2nd 7th Infantry Battalion provided the division's reserve element, while the 2nd 6th carried out an advance to the south of the fortress to divert defenders' attention. Following the initial phase of the operation, the 2nd 5th and 2nd 7th then pushed through the gap created by the 16th Brigade and advanced southeasterly against the Italian defences. The brigade struggled to make progress during this phase and had to be reinforced by the 2nd 11th Infantry Battalion from the 19th Brigade. This was followed up by the capture of Tobruk on the 20th of January, during which the 17th Brigade was again allocated a secondary role, providing reinforcements to the assaulting brigades. In the aftermath, the Italians began to fall back towards Tripoli, and the 17th Brigade was pushed forward in pursuit, with the 2nd 7th Infantry Battalion capturing Barke and then the Massa Brega before the 20th Brigade arrived to relieve them. This was part of preparations to redeploy the 6th Division to Greece in response to promises to defend the country against an expected German invasion. The brigade subsequently concentrated around Amiara in Egypt on the 28th of March. On the 6th of April, the 17th Brigade headquarters, designated Luster 7, boarded the transport ship, the City of Karachi, and arrived in Piraeus, the chief port of Greece, on the 12th with Captain Honnor's 2nd 11th Battalion. When they arrived, they became part of the reformed Anzac Corps with the New Zealand forces. On the same day that the 17th Brigade boarded the city of Karachi, German forces attacked Greece and Yugoslavia simultaneously, including a devastating air attack on the Piraeus. Due to the damage sustained to Piraeus, the city of Karachi was forced to divert to Volos, while the rest of the convoy was able to land at Piraeus. The Allies lost the initiative well before the 17th Brigade arrived and never regained it. Yugoslavia capitulated quickly, which cut the Greek supply lines to their own forces on the Italian front, and within a week, the Allied forces were in full retreat. The campaign was hindered by poor communications between the Greek and British commanders, the primitive road and rail system of Greece, the difficult terrain, and the speed and success of the German advance. Lieutenant General John Coates has summed up the campaign thus, quote, "Yet, as in almost every Allied campaign in the early part of the war, the worst mistakes of the politicians and strategists were moderated by the bravery, fighting qualities, and the sheer dogged determination of the troops. Greece was no exception," unquote. 2 days after landing, Lacey and the rest of the headquarters unit was assigned to be a part of Savage Force, and they first boarded trucks from the Daphne camp, then travelled by train for the 3-day journey towards the front to take up blocking positions on the left flank of the newly reformed Anzac forces at Domokos as the German advance was in full swing. While battalions of the brigade held rearguard positions, the headquarters unit along with the 2nd 11th and 2nd 5th battalions held positions on the Greneva-Kalabaka road to cover the withdrawal of British armoured units and the exhausted Greek army on the 16th. They would hold the area for 2 days until word reached Savage Force that they were withdrawing. First to the Zarkos defensive positions, but as the roads south were congested, it was changed to the transport hub of Larissa. The 2nd 11th would leave Savage Force at this point and to assume positions at Zarkos, and for their exploits, I recommend listening to my Ralph Honor episodes. From Larissa, the rest of Savage Force would be redeployed to defend the Brolos Pass on the 18th of April, and Savage Force would officially cease to exist the following day as the force reverted control back to the 6th Australian Division. At this point, Lacey and the rest of brigade headquarters were located in a churchyard north of the village, and it's also at some point in this campaign that Lacey was also promoted once more to sergeant. As elements of the 17th Brigade participated in the Battle of Pinos Gorge on the 17th-18th of April under General Allen's 19th Brigade, the rest of the unit bunkered down and tried to catch their breath. On the 19th of April, Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Wavell, Middle Eastern Command, arrived in Greece and after consulting with General Sir Henry Wilson, the Allied commander in Greece, determined that the presence of British and Dominion troops on Greece served no further purpose and ordered the evacuation of Allied personnel by all possible means. The following day, the withdrawal order was given. On the 20th, Savage, whose brigade now only comprised of the 2nd 6th and 2nd 7th battalions, had received orders to guard 4 road and rail exits from the mountains to the west of the Brolos positions to cover the Lamia-Brolos road in depth from a point 1 mile northwest of Brolos. The effect of this would be to link the 17th Brigade in behind the 19th to protect their flank, and at dusk, however, Savage received new orders. Take over General Vasey, the commander of 19th Brigade's flank, to occupy a line covering the gorge through which the railway line ran, and extending it along high ground for about 1 mile to the west of Gardikaki. In addition, his left flank was to be extended a further 1.5 miles to about 6 miles measured on a map. The road and track exits on the west were now made the responsibility of the 16th Brigade, which were only comprised of 2 weak battalions. In conference on the 21st, Savage and Vasey agreed that Savage should take over all ground which Vasey then held west of the Lamia-Brolos road. The country in his positions was extremely rugged. By dusk on the 21st, the 2nd 7th Battalion was in position from the main road about 4 miles forward of Brolos to the railway and just beyond, with the 2nd 6th extending the line for about 4 miles to the west. That day, the 2nd 5th Battalion returned to Savage's command and went into reserve just west of Brolos. Despite proclamations, there would be no further withdrawals, and General Vasey proudly proclaiming, quote, "Here we bloody well are and here we bloody well stay," unquote, on the 22nd, owing to the proximity to Anzac Day and not wanting to risk German encirclement of the second raising of the Anzac Corps in the Balkans, in an operation that had already been dubbed at the time the Second Gallipoli, both Generals Ivan Mackay, commander of 6th Division, and Bernard Freiberg, VC, commander of New Zealand's 2nd Division, issued evacuation orders to their respective commands. Withdrawal was hard for the Australian units. William Osborne, a gunner in the 2nd and 3rd Field Regiment, recalled that the roads were filled with refugees making their way south and there was constant attacks from Luftwaffe aircraft during the day. As a result, they travelled almost exclusively by night, but the retreat didn't result in panic or chaos. This was the experience of much of Lusterforce. The Anzac forces were usually the ones tasked with providing the rear guard. General Mackay decided that his 1st Brigade group to withdraw on the 23rd to 24th would consist of Allen's depleted brigade, less William Travers' 2nd 1st Battalion, Savage's brigade, and part of the 2nd 8th Battalion. It would be named Allen Group, as Tubby Allen was the senior brigadier in command. It was impossible for commanders to control the slowly moving column, which their cars were merely links in the long chain. By the roadside, during a halt, Brigadier Clive Steele of the 6th Divisional Engineers and General Savage met and agreed that it was inadvisable for staff cars to weave their way forward when the column was halted to discover what was causing the delay, because of the risk that the troops might interpret this as signifying the officers in the staff cars were evacuating. These leaders, like other senior officers, made themselves conspicuous on the roadside or went calmly about their duties at their headquarters, setting an example of cool behaviour under fire. By the night of the 24th, the 17th Brigade was being concealed at Megara to wait embarkation, though they would be removed to the Agros area on Anzac Day before moving once more to Kalamata, though they would not embark until the 26th, where they boarded destroyers that ferried them out to waiting transports. In total, the 17th Brigade suffered heavily on Greece and subsequently on Crete, sustaining 1,200 killed, wounded and missing, including 61 members of the brigade headquarters being reported missing. One of those was Sergeant Henry Armstrong Lacey. Lacey had been ordered to sabotage all remaining brigade vehicles to prevent their use by German or Italian forces, and after being shown how to actually start the trucks, as he had no previous working experience with internal combustion engines, having been a horseman his entire life, he was then instructed to drain all the sumps, run the engines until they seized, and then lob a hand grenade into the cab. Unfortunately, once he and the men he had under his command completed their task and they returned to the port to be evacuated, they were informed that, quote, the smudge on the horizon is the last ship out, unquote. Henry Lacey would be officially listed as missing on the 13th of June 1941, though in reality he had been captured by German forces on Greece on the 29th of May. He was interred at the Salonika transit camp, which comprised of an old Greek barracks building, and after that he was taken to Stalag 18A on the 12th of June. His status as a POW was confirmed through the Red Cross 5 days later. Compared to the experiences of William Holmes Travers, who was also captured by German forces but on Crete, he was an officer and thus didn't have to work under the conditions listed in the Geneva Convention. Henry Lacey, as a sergeant, sadly, was not afforded the same protections and had to work. That being said, as Lacey was a strong Union man, he definitely made an impact on the camp, much to the frustration of the camp administrators. Due to the location of Stalag 18A in Wolfsburg in southern Austria, the main working duties of the prisoners was agriculture, forestry, trade, and industry. For Lacey, he was assigned to work camp 10,925 GW in Lesage in the Drau Valley in the eastern Tyrol. There he did river work, as part of the crews of prisoners building a roadway over the steep mountains. For their work, each prisoner was paid the equivalent of 11 pence per day, which equates to about $4.40 in today's money. This money was used to allow them to buy supplies, food, and medicine from civilian vendors and from the camp stores. In June, to accommodate overcrowding, additional barracks were built to accommodate close to 39,000 prisoners registered to the camp. As I mentioned in my episode about William Holmes Travers, while the conditions for the French and British Commonwealth prisoners at the camp weren't great, they were still leagues better than the conditions afforded to the Russian POWs. At Stalag 18A, estimates are as high as 60% of them dying while in captivity. From all accounts, life at Stalag 18A, at least in the beginning, for Western Allied prisoners was organised with sufficient food and heating provided by the Red Cross, and by large the administration of the camp was conducted by quote-unquote men of confidence, who were elected to liaise with the German officials and representatives of the International Red Cross Committee. As winter set in and the weather dropped, however, the prisoners found themselves without adequate boots of underclothes to combat the cold. The International Red Cross, unsatisfied with the conditions and clothing of the prisoners, relayed this back to British authorities who supplied the prisoners with new uniforms. Though due to a dispute between the Germans and the men of confidence, these would not be delivered until January 1942. 1942 would also see both of Lacey's eldest sons, Henry Lacey Jr. and Frank Douglas Lacey, both former members of the militia, ignore their father's advice and volunteer for the AIF, with Lacey Jr. enlisting in July of 42 at Alice Springs, Northern Territory, joining the 2nd General Transport Company of the Australian Army Service Corps, and served in Australia, ending the war with No. 5 Australian Refrigeration Plant Operating Platoon, and his brother Frank also joining the 2nd General Transport Company of the Army Service Corps the month later in August, though it should be noted that on Frank's service record he gives his father's name as Robert. Frank would end the war attached to the 2nd 9th Australian General Hospital and did see some service in the Pacific. Sergeant Henry Armstrong Lacey Snr would be liberated on May 8, 1945, with 5 British soldiers parachuted into a nearby field, though in reality the camp had already been handed over to the prisoners as the day before when Germany surrendered. The inmates then relieved the guards of their weapons and secured the railway station, the armory, and the post office, as well as the local police station. And with the assistance of medical staff on the 10th of May, the Western Allies decided to be evacuated back to Britain. The Russian prisoners, sadly, were kept at the camp and used to exchange for British and American POWs in Russian camps. Sadly, those Russians who survived captivity were more often than not marched straight into Russian camps after being branded traitors for surrendering in the first place. Henry Lacey Snr would arrive in England on the 28th of May 1945 and, now aged 59, was flown back to Australia by way of the United States in mid-September and would be formally discharged from his third war on the 4th of October 1945. On his return to Australia, he was admitted to 115 Australian General Hospital at Heidelberg, and on his return, Lacey had also had to remember that he declared to the recruiter that he was only 35, not 54. This is evidenced by the fact that on his discharge paperwork, he initially writes his true date of birth and age, before crossing them off and giving the ages he gave back in 1939. 1946 would see Lacey still recovering from his captivity at the Caulfield Repatriation Hospital, though interestingly, the electoral roll for that year also has him listed as a presser, despite being aged 60. Sergeant Henry Armstrong Lacey, British Empire Medal, Military Medal, passed away on the 29th of March 1970 at the age of 83. He was cremated at the Springvale Botanical Cemetery and he was survived by his 3 sons. He outlived his wife Winifred by 6 years. At the end, Sergeant Henry Armstrong Lacey, British Empire Medal, Military Medal, was promoted to Sergeant 4 times in 3 conflicts. Was entitled to wear the King South Africa Medal, the Natal Native Rebellion Medal, the 1914-15 Star, the British War Medal, the Victory Medal, the 1939-45 Star, Africa Star, Defence Medal, War Medal, and Australian Service Medal, along with the Military Medal and the British Empire Medal, Military Division, as well as the Gallipoli Medallion. Henry Armstrong Lacey's military journey is one of the 20th century. From the plains of South Africa during the Boer War to the trenches on the Western Front in the First, and finally to the deserts of North Africa and the mountains of Greece in the Second World War. Now, we may never know why he continued to answer the trumpet's call. His continued service is a testament to the indelible belief of putting service before self, and the enduring spirit of dedication and resilience. His ability to serve with distinction in 3 separate conflicts, despite the physical and emotional toil it undoubtedly took, is a reflection on his remarkable character and unwavering commitment, and for that commitment, we are eternally grateful. Sources for this episode are the History Guild website, the Queensland State Archives Boer War records, index to the Home Secretary's Office record of the names of all ranks who served in the South African War from the 1st of November 1899 to circa 1901, the State Library of Queensland, the National Library of Australia, the Trove Online Newspaper Archive by the National Library of Australia, the Find a Grave website, the Australian Cemeteries Index, the Victorian Department of Births, Deaths and Marriages, the Manifest of HMAT A20 Horiata, the Australian Boer War Memorial Association, the service record of Henry Lacey, Henry Armstrong Lacey Jr. and Frank Douglas Lacey, the official records of the Australian military contingents of the war in South Africa 1899 to 1902, the Australians serving in the Boer War website, the Department of Veterans Affairs nominal rolls, the Department of Veterans Affairs Anzac portal, myheritage.com, the Virtual War Memorial Australia, Great War 1914-1918 forum, following the 22nd, the First World War through the lives of an Australian Infantry Battalion, venereal disease from the International Encyclopedia of the First World War, the Australian Army's 2 traditional diseases, gonorrhea and syphilis, a military medical history during the 20th century, the official history of Australia in the War of 1914-1918, the official history of Australia's medical services in the War of 1914-1918, Australia in the War of 1939-1945, Series 1, Army, the Prisoner of War Rolls of 1939-1945, Middle East, the Red Cross Association's Missing a Prisoner of War file on Henry Armstrong Lacey, Swastikas over the Acropolis, reinterpreting the Nazi invasion of Greece in World War II by Craig Stockings and Eleanor Hancock, the Battle of Brelos Pass from AWM London, the Battle of Greece from the Anzacs of Greece website, the unit diaries of the 24th Australian Infantry Battalion, the 2nd 6th Australian Infantry Battalion, and the 17th Australian Infantry Brigade, friends of the podcast, the Australian Military History Podcast, the AIF project from the University of New South Wales, and the website of the Australian War Memorial. I was only doing my job, and the Australian Military History Podcast is made possible thanks to the generous support from each and every one of you, but especially to the members of our Armoured Emu Brigade community. Now, if you want to continue the conversation or suggest the topic for a future episode, you can do so on all our social media channels. At this point, the podcast is on everything under @IWODMJ. Links to everything are in the show description. If you want to join the Armoured Emu Brigade community, you can also do so on our Discord server. The invite link to that is on the episode description and on the podcast website, www.thegdocnetwork.net. There you can find also show notes, transcripts, and photos of my various travels that are locating the myriad of memorials dotted around Australia. If you like what I do here on the podcast and want to directly support the work that I do, you can either buy the podcast a one-off coffee or support us on Patreon for exclusive podcasts, interviews, and giveaways. Each cent raised goes directly into improving the podcast, from digitization of service records and the purchasing of reference material to the distribution and licensing of each and every piece of content. But the best thing you can do is rate this episode on your platform of choice, leave a review, or share it with a friend. It's the easiest way to show your support and get the show into the ears of people who need to hear it. Thanks for listening to I Was Only Doing My Job, an Australian military history podcast, a Doc Network production. This episode was recorded on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, whose elders have passed on knowledge for thousands of years, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This podcast is mostly a one-man show, with me doing the writing, researching, recording, audio engineering, and directing, with additional research done by Laurie Favell of My Silent Hero. All opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of the speaker and do not represent the opinions or views of any agency, entity, or organization. It is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License. And until next time, friends, catch you then. Bye.